purpose of this webinar series is, first of all, to give you an opportunity to get regular updates about what's happening in Israel, a little bit from behind the scenes, a little bit from a deeper perspective, but also from a very special perspective that the Engaging Israel project is trying to develop. And our goal is to kind of bring back a look at the issues that Israel is facing from a Jewish perspective, from a Jewish values perspective. Those of you who are familiar with the Engaging Israel materials and the DVD series perhaps and the curricula will know this. Those of you who are not yet familiar with that, I encourage you to go to the Hartman website and begin to familiarize yourself with a new way of talking about Israel and the issues of Israel with Jewish eyes. Today I want to talk specifically, and I know many people want to really use these sessions as a way to get more familiar with what's happening in Israel. And I'd like to speak specifically about three areas in which, three challenges that Israel is facing. But I want to set the tone for that in a very particular way. For those of you who know me, most of my career has been in government, not in Jewish education. And I've spent most of my time focusing on Israel's crises. And in the iEngage project, we've tried to distance ourselves a little bit from the crisis narrative. This constant preoccupation with the fact that somehow Israel's existence is precarious and temporary, and begin to ask some deeper questions about how we live and make the most of the opportunities that Jewish sovereignty offers. So today I'd like to talk and cast the issues that Israel faces not as crises, but as uncertainties. And I think even that small change of talking about the things that Israel, the challenges that Israel faces as moments of uncertainty has a subtext to it that's important, I think, to take a moment to explain. When you speak of crises, I think you touch on a very, very common Jewish state of being, state of mind. This idea that our existence is in danger, is temporary. And also, when we talk of crisis, we also hope for resolution. We hope for some kind of redemption from that crisis. We imagine ourselves as a country that is either having a crisis or has solved the crisis. And one of the challenges that Israel poses, I think, is that as a country, it's not a math problem. Math problems has solutions, but the real life of living in Israel is a life that is complex, and the challenges that Israel faces don't necessarily have solutions. They can either be better or worse. Our predicament can be better or worse. And so I'd like to talk about this more as the uncertainties that Israel is facing at the moment. And then after we discuss a little bit three areas, particularly the issues that have been in the media a lot lately about Iran, about the Arab Spring and the Arab uprisings, and on the Palestinian front, I'd like to take a moment to kind of invite you to think about Jewish attitudes towards uncertainty and how we might begin to conceptualize our Jewish predicament in Israel as, rather than crisis, as a moment of question. I would say, as you've probably seen in the media if you follow Israel closely, this is a moment of extreme uncertainty. In fact, it's a situation in which almost every arena in which Israel is being challenged, in the foreign policy arena in particular, each arena is itself uncertain. We don't know what will happen. And each of those uncertainties are influencing one another, are impacting on one another. And I'd like to focus on three in particular, the first being Iran. Now, Iran is an issue which has recently come up because of the issuance of the report of the International Atomic Energy Agency, which has revealed something and made public and legitimate something which we have known for a long time, that Iran is pursuing a nuclear weapons program. The result of this report is to essentially put that information in the public space. It's no longer a claim that several governments are making, the US, Israel, France, the UK and others, but it is something that is now part of the international space. It will hopefully create the moment or the opportunity in order to increase pressure on Iran. This week there will be, on the 15th, there will be a beginning of a Board of Governors meeting in Vienna, with the IAEA headquarters, where there will be an attempt to condemn Iran because of its violations of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the hope will be that that will create the basis for further sanctions and potentially further action. But, you know, one of the things I want to talk about with respect to Iran that I think is important to understand is how much uncertainty there is around Iran, and how much of what is written about Iran, I think, really deserves very little attention, frankly. If I had to write a document about Iran today, it would be a 2-page document that listed all the things you needed to know in order to speak intelligently about Iran. And that's more or less, and I would say there are probably about 15 people in Israel and a handful of people around the world who have enough of the information on that kind of checklist to able to speak intelligently about the options, the military options, the sanctions options, what might work and not. Almost all of the commentary is written by people who do not have access to that information. And there is this kind of desire for certainty, for knowing that military action will produce a certain outcome, or that if only we engage in sanctions of a certain kind, at the moment there's a move for sanctions against the Central Bank of Iran, then this crisis will be solved. We simply don't know enough to answer that question. To give you one example of something we don't know exactly what is that point, that threshold that Iran crosses that becomes the point of no return from our perspective, a point at which it is no longer possible to prevent the nuclear weapons program, and a point at which certain action is necessary. You need to know things about capabilities and the capability of Israel to withstand a response. A lot of factors which the public at large, this is not a decision which is going to be taken in a democratic way. There won't be, as much as there's a lot of noise about Iran, a lot of discussion about the Iranian issue, we simply have to, as a public, as a Jewish public, as a people that care about Israel, we simply have to kind of be somewhat resigned to the fact that we don't know enough to have an intelligent debate about this issue, to know what it is that we need to do in order to confront this threat. And there's a great unease living in that uncertainty. Will it be the sanctions that work? Will it be military action that works? What are the consequences? These are not things that even the people who know the details you need to know to talk intelligently about it have a full picture of, and certainly we don't. And we can take one or two options in relation to that. The first is to pretend that we do know, and have a kind of pseudo-serious conversation where we write op-eds and give drashot in shul that say, you know, this needs to happen against Iran and that needs to happen against Iran. And we can kind of comfort ourselves with that kind of false certainty, delude ourselves that we know enough to speak intelligently about it. The other option, a much less comfortable option, is just to carry that uncertainty, to carry the fact that we don't know enough about the Iranian issue, to carry the fact that there are certain people who will be making decisions one way or another on this issue without us being able to gauge even at the first instance whether those decisions are wise or not. And that's a real challenge, I think, for those who want to view Israel's predicament in terms of crises and resolution, as if we know what the solution on the shelf is and we just need to grab it. We don't have enough to know the contours of the problem to even begin a discussion about the solution. And that's a very uncomfortable place to be in. But in fact, I think it's a very common place for a sovereign state to be in, particularly one with Israel's challenges. And I think this same idea of uncertainty can be applied across to the issue of the Arab uprisings. Some call it the Arab Spring. You know, in Israel, I like to say we're not that good at our meteorological skills, but it doesn't feel like spring to us. And there was a moment, I think, immediately as the uprisings began in Tunisia and Egypt, where people wanted to wrap themselves like in a warm blanket in a new paradigm. This was a moment of democracy. And there was this kind of euphoria, particularly in the US and around the world, that here there was going to be this transformation of the Arab world towards democracy. And the discourse in Israel about this, we were like the people you didn't want to invite to a party. We were the people who said, you know, wait a minute, we'd like it to be this amazing transition to democracy, but we're simply not sure. You know, for all the enthusiasm and hope and inspiration that the youth involved in those uprisings promised, what we are seeing in the region is a democratic opening that is at least at the moment, being exploited by Islamists who are hardly democratic in their nature, who are taking advantage, who are more organized, and who may be shaping a Middle East that is much less hospitable to coexistence, much more dangerous and much more uncertain. If we look across the region from a kind of strategic perspective, what we see, unfortunately, at the first stage is that more radical forces, particularly Islamist forces, who have been on the margins of the political structures within their societies, are now moving to play part in the political game. And gradually, over time, the trajectory is that they will begin to take a decisive role in that game. If you look in Lebanon, where Hezbollah essentially has a veto on Lebanese policy, if you look at how the Muslim Brotherhood is positioned now in Egypt to take a big chunk of the vote in the next elections coming up, in the parliamentary elections. In Tunisia, the elections held produced a victory for the Islamist party called Nada. Nada, not the Spanish Nada meaning nothing, but the Arabic Nada meaning Renaissance. In Libya, the NTC, the council which NATO supported, the leader of the NTC, in his very first speech after Gaddafi left office, he had a 10-minute speech, and you know what he devoted that 10-minute speech to? He managed within those 10 minutes to point out that polygamy would now be permitted and that banks could no longer charge interest in Libya. A return to the Islamist roots, and you found a lot of people within the NATO structure who had supported the uprising saying, hold on a minute, this isn't the democracy we had hoped for, and a lot of questions being asked about the direction that Libya is headed. For Israel in particular, this poses a particular challenge in Egypt, because I think that the relations with Egypt are probably at the most precarious place that they've been in since the peace treaty. And the reason for that is that in revolutions and uprisings like this, you have a transition of fear. You have situations where populations that are afraid of regimes transition into regimes that are afraid of populations. And regimes that are afraid of populations do not do popular things. They do populist things, they don't do unpopular things. They don't negotiate with Israel. They don't defend a relationship with the Jewish state. And you see that the military council, the SCAF, the military governing body in Egypt, feels much less able, given public sentiment in Egypt, to defend and protect the Israeli-Egyptian relationship. The result of that is that extremist forces see an opportunity to damage and potentially fatally damage the relationship with Egypt. And so we see an increasing risk of hostility from Sinai against Israel. We had the terrorist attack a few weeks ago that killed 8 Israelis. We had the assault on the embassy, essentially where what stood between Israel and a real severe blow to the Israeli-Egyptian relationship was a steel door and a phone call from President Obama. The steel door that protected the 6 security guards that were on the other side of that door, the Israeli security guard, and eventually the phone call that President Obama made, which led the Egyptian forces to protect us. But it's not to protect the embassy and push the mob back. But it's not clear that that will continue. So we're facing a region where, we had what perhaps would be a somewhat unstable pacts with dictators towards a region of real uncertainty. And again, the option of a kind of euphoric moment of saying we're on the verge of a democratic change in the Middle East, I think is not true to the reality we find ourselves in. We don't yet know what the paradigm is. We don't yet know where we're headed. And we face a region in which, in each country, there will be a political structure that will be much harder for us to cope with. And this, there's a particular expression of this, I think, in the Palestinian arena. We can comfort ourselves, if we like, with the certainty that, I would say it's the certainty of the blame game, in which Israel feels confident that it's done what it could to begin negotiations with the Palestinians to offer a chance for a 2-state framework. And the Palestinians, unfortunately, have missed that opportunity. But again, this is seeking comfort, I think, in arguments, in the winning of arguments. It's not really about dealing with the uncertainty of the situation. And to focus in particular to what's happening at the moment, I think the first issue that we're dealing with in an immediate sense in the Palestinian arena is the issue of the United Nations. It looks quite likely that there will be a vote in the Security Council that the Palestinians will lose. And they may lose it, they may not even get the majority needed for a US veto, they may not get 9 votes in the Council. And as a result of that, the question the Palestinians will need to ask is whether they're going to go to the General Assembly and pursue a resolution which would perhaps acknowledge Palestine as a non-member state, give it a kind of status that the Vatican has, with potentially negative consequences. We talked about this in the last conference call for those of you who participated. And I think, though there is a very high expectation that the Palestinians will go to the General Assembly, I actually think that it's quite uncertain whether they will or not. I think Abu Mazen is unlikely to go to the General Assembly for his own calculations, which deal with an issue of much greater uncertainty, and that is the prospect of Abu Mazen's resignation, the chance that we may be looking at the potential breakdown in the Israeli-Palestinian relationship as we've known it until now. It's not a certainty, but increasingly one hears on the Palestinian side discussion of how they hope to collapse the Palestinian Authority or potentially limit its cooperation with Israel. We don't know yet, and it's hard to imagine what a post-Palestinian Authority or post-Abu Mazen, assuming he resigns, West Bank looks like. We don't know yet how Jordan will fare, for instance, as a result of the Arab uprisings and these kind of developments. And the comfort of arguing how right we are is very, very small comfort when we're really looking at a deeply uncertain situation. The dynamic, I think, on the Palestinian side is a dynamic in which, almost by inertia and in, I would say, typical dysfunctional fashion, the Palestinians are moving towards aligning themselves more authentically with the Arab uprisings around them. If they cannot get a state in the way that they had hoped, either at the negotiating table with the demands that they had, which for many Israelis were unacceptable, and for some Israelis they never really wanted, and if they can't get it at the UN, then it seems like they're moving towards the direction of saying, let us at least return to an authentic resistance movement. Let us align ourselves more in a more genuine way with those in Libya and in Egypt and in Tunisia and elsewhere who are rising up. And that means reimagining from a Palestinian perspective the nature of their relationship with Israel and the US. And as far as they're concerned, it means potentially cutting ties, potentially increasing cooperation between Fatah and Hamas. And we face a time of really deep uncertainty where we don't know what the nature of the Israeli-Palestinian relationship will be going forward. I think, unfortunately, we can be fairly confident that it's not going to look like a peace agreement anytime soon. But we don't know whether the present dynamic of Israeli-Palestinian security cooperation, of relative stability and economic stability as well in the West Bank will continue, or whether we'll see a downward spiral. So the thing I wanted to leave you with on these issues is simply that we face so much uncertainty, so much discomfort in this place where we don't have a paradigm. We don't have that wonderful mix of we've moved from this moment to that moment. This is our overarching principle. This is how we'll move forward. And that's a moment, I think, that is uncomfortable for many of us. And it makes me want to explore in the minutes I have before we look at some questions a little bit about how we might think about uncertainty from a Jewish perspective. I think the first point I want to make about this is that there are two ways to think about stability and our desire for stability. I would say the first is to hope that we can create a stable environment around us. We wake up in the morning and we're worried because we don't know what's going to happen with Iran and we don't know what's going to happen with the Arab uprisings around us. We don't know the nature of the relations with the Palestinians. There are so many unknowns. And so we have this urge, this expectation that it will be okay when we create an environment around us that is stable. But there's another way to envisage stability. And that's a stability that comes not from some expectation that your external environment will be calm. That's an expectation, I think, that is beyond reach. That's a messianic expectation. That's an expectation that comes from this mode of crisis and resolution, of exile and redemption. The stability that one might look for is a stability that comes from within, from an internal compass, from, often when I speak, particularly when I speak to American audiences, the audiences are a little annoyed because I haven't given them a Hollywood ending. I haven't told them how at the end of all this there's still hope and there's still optimism. There's inevitably someone who gets up in the crowd and says, in the audience, and says, but you haven't told me why I can be optimistic. Tell me some external factor that gives me a reason for optimism. And I think that the sources of our stability, of our optimism, or of our hope are not by searching desperately in our external environment for that which gives us hope. It is much more about an internal look at, are we well placed as a society, as individuals, as Jews, to cope with what is the inevitable predicament of a sovereign Jewish state that is not in a redemptive phase. And that's the question we need to ask ourselves. One way of thinking about it is, if you are, the moment, this uncertainty we face until we find a solution, it's very comforting to think that perhaps we can just bunker down. But there is a fundamental difference between a hurricane that may be coming for 2 weeks, where more or less what you do is you get some supplies and you go down underground to a basement, and a hurricane you feel that may be coming for 10 years. That you don't know the nature of the environment you're going to be in for an extended period. The questions you need to ask yourselves are very different. The question you need to ask yourselves, in addition to how do I respond to these crises around me, is a question of, do I have the right makeup, social makeup, psychological makeup, individually and as a society, in order to respond to an extended period of uncertainty? I'm reminded in my career in government of the way different prime ministers throughout Israel history have responded to crisis. Arik Sharon, I remember, was very good at finding this kind of immediate inner tranquility. He used to say very often that the first thing one needs to have the minute there's a crisis, the minute one feels a tremendous threat, is quiet. And he was speaking not just about quiet that people wouldn't be panicking, but a certain internal tranquility and an internal confidence in your capacity to deal with the inevitable uncertainty. Not some kind of false hope in redemption, in that sense, but an internal belief in your capacity to respond to a situation and make it better and cope in very simple terms. One way of thinking about this, I think, in Jewish terms, is the transition and the nature of the transition of the Jewish people from the Midbar to Eretz Israel. The existence in the Midbar was an existence where everything was known. The manna came. There weren't surprises. The sense of Hashem's presence amongst the people was very clear. And the transition to Eretz Israel was a transition to uncertainty, where you weren't sure where your sustenance was coming from. And very much depended, and the psukim throughout, from Vayikra, throughout Devarim, of the move to Eretz Israel, repeat again and again this idea that the transition to Eretz Israel depends a great deal on our own behavior, on how we build a relationship to the land that we're in that is genuine and strong and with morality and with values. In the Parshiot that we read now, we have a wonderful comparison over the last few weeks between Avraham and Yitzhak. It's amazing how many incidents both Avraham and Yitzhak face that are the same or are similar. Both have barren wives, both are faced with famine, both have an altercation and an interaction with Avimelech, both deal with sons that one is accepted and one is not accepted. If you look, it's a wonderful thing to research, the parallels between Avraham and Yitzhak's response to the challenges that they face, which were very similar challenges. And I wanted to just mention one of them before wrapping up and letting you ask questions. When Avraham faces a ra'av, a famine, he immediately after arriving to Canaan, he leaves for Mitzrayim. And Yitzhak doesn't have that option. Yitzhak not only chooses to stay within the boundaries of Eretz Israel, of Eretz Canaan, Hashem specifically tells him, you are not the one who's going to leave. You are stuck with the predicament of life in Israel, however it may be, famine or not famine, redemption or not redemption. You're not going to have, you are already the descendant of Yitzhak, you're beginning to create a people, and it might be okay for an individual, as an individual choice to leave, but it's not okay for a nation to leave their homeland. And you're just going to have to deal with this predicament. And the psukim, not in this week's parasha, but in Toldot, I find something quite interesting in one of Yitzchak's reactions to this. One of Yitzchak's reactions to the ra'av, to the famine, is the following. Vayashov Yitzchak vayachpor et be'erot hamayim asher chafru b'yemei Avraham aviv vayesatmum plishtim acharei mot Avraham vayikra lahem shemot b'shemot asher kara lahem aviv. So he doesn't go to Egypt in a famine. What Yitzchak does is go back to the wells that Avraham, his father, dug in Eretz Israel, that the Plishtim had covered over. He redigs those wells and he names them again, the names that Avraham, his father, had given them. And one way to look at this is that in response to the predicament that Yitzchak found himself in Israel, he didn't look, on the one hand, for redemption or for escape. He had the responsibility already, as the second generation father of a nation, to look at the resources that were within the country to cope with that situation itself. The pasuk afterwards, I think, beautifully describes the be'er that they find as be'er ma'im chayim, a well of living water. It was for Yitzchak a search inwards, a search to what were the resources within the land itself in order to cope with the stresses and the dangers that he faced. And I think one of the things we need to ask ourselves in coping with these uncertainties is how would we like our people to be in relation to that uncertainty? What kind of moral fiber do we want them to have? What is the nature of the conversation we want them to be having? How much can values and their own connection to their own sources and their own resources within the Jewish tradition strengthen them in dealing with that uncertainty and dealing with the knowledge that there may not be a solution? And rather than constantly look outward and ask, well, what do we not know and know about Iran? The question maybe to ask as well is how do we best position ourselves as a people with the predicament of not knowing? With this moment of not knowing. What do we find in our tradition and in ourselves and in our vibrancy as a people and in the richness of our conversation that enables us to just hold it with that uncertainty, to not have an answer straight away, to not have an answer the next day either, but to maybe have ways that ask us how can we prepare our people for a long period of uncertainty with the resources that we have. This is what I think comes from a mature, sovereign state of mind. A more mature Jewish discussion doesn't think that there are solutions on the shelf, either in terms of military action, which we don't know the consequences of, we don't know the context. Sometimes it's relevant, sometimes it's not. Or some magical peace agreement which will bring us into the Messianic era. It's messier than that. And I think we can cope and live with that messiness much better if we, A, acknowledge it, and B, ask ourselves one more question. Not just how close is Iran to a nuclear weapon, not just are we at the beginning of democracy or will Islamist regimes encircle us, but who are we as a people? What strengths can we fall back on? What kind of conversation and society can we produce that is just able to cope with uncertainty and be comfortable in it and find stability within rather than outside of us? So I'd like to address a few questions that we've had. I'll begin with one of the questions which relates to, that we've received, which relates to how to engage young and old unengaged Jews. This is a question from Ed Baldwin in New York. Thank you. I think, in the Engaging Israel project, the approach we've taken is that Israel can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. And I think, we're not trying to suggest, and the idea isn't, that for those for whom a connection to Israel is focused on the threats that Israel faces, that's one way to identify with Israel. But there are other options, and particularly for the younger generation, for whom Israel's survival is something they don't connect with so naturally. The kinds of questions and the kind of conversation you need to develop has a lot more to do with not how Israel should survive, but more with why it should survive. What is the kind of society that we're trying to create here? What are the opportunities that Jewish sovereignty provides for a meaningful and compelling Jewish life that's relevant for Jews in Israel and outside it? And I think we really need to open the conversation, and I encourage those who ask these questions just to begin to look at the Hartman website and the conversations we're trying to create in different communities in Israel and in America, across the North America, to look at Israel with fresh eyes, and not solely in this narrative of waking up in the morning and asking who is threatening us from the outside. Another question we have is whether Israel can engage the current Palestinian leadership. So very often this question is asked in terms of, can we trust the Palestinian leadership? What are their intentions, and so on. In my view, I have a kind of very narrow, actually, and selfish view of this, and it's measured only by Israel's interests. I think most Jews would probably share the view that we would like Israel to be a vibrant Jewish and democratic state, as secure and as at peace with its neighbors as possible. I put it in that way because I'm a little cynical about this moment of absolute security and absolute peace. And the only question one needs to ask oneself at any given time is, what are the tools in the toolbox that best advance that objective? So at the moment, we have a PA leadership that, for all its faults, in my opinion, engagement with it encourages and improves the chances of stability in the region, pushes back the more extremist forces in Hamas and elsewhere, and potentially shows that those who are not engaged in terrorism, those who are not engaged in violence, those who are willing to engage in legitimate conversation with Israel, that is a more productive way to enhance their interests. As I often say, Abu Mazen is not a member of the Hadassah Women's League of New Jersey. We're not dealing here with Zionists, and I think the expectation sometimes that that the leadership we're dealing with will be completely aligned with our interests is a distant one, is one that I don't think is within reach. We should have demands of them, but the question really is only about us, in my opinion, and that is how not only are our interests but also our values best served. Are they best served by trying to engage those Palestinians with which possibly we can empower a move where Palestinian self-determination comes together with respecting Jewish self-determination? Are we best served by refusing to talk to them? And I think that's probably a better way to discuss this. We have another question about Foreign Minister Lieberman's comments today, which related to some idea that has come up in the media, I think a very dangerous idea, this notion that we should really pursue the idea of a Palestinian state in Jordan. Something that this is a very important point, I think, that Israel's security border, its strategic depth, in large part is found in the external borders of Jordan, not in the Jordan Valley, and certainly not on the what's called the Green Line. Because a secure Jordan, a secure Hashemite kingdom of Jordan on its external borders prevents the infiltration of Iranian and jihadi forces. It would be a very soft belly for the influx of weapons and militants against Israel. So we have a vested security interest in the stability of the Hashemite kingdom. We very much hope, and I think we share an interest with Jordan, I think, in this regard, that there can be the responsible exercise of Palestinian self-determination that is neither a threat to Israel nor a threat to the Hashemite kingdom. Whether or not we can get there is another question. But again, I think it goes back to one of the messages I want to leave you with today. And the message is that one of the questions, because, I have an allergy to the word strategy in the Middle East, because it implies this idea that you can control the outcome. And in the Middle East, there's just too much uncertainty. There are too many forces out of your control. The thing you can control is your conduct, the morality of your conduct, the integrity of your conduct, the connection of your own conduct to an overall interest that you may have. And I think as a country, our obligation is to position ourselves in a way where we make clear that we are not an obstacle to the responsible exercise of Palestinian self-determination that respects Jewish self-determination. We may not be able to realize it because there are just too many forces that may not enable us to produce that outcome. But I think in terms, again, of who we want to be as a society, it's our obligation to ask ourselves, is that what we're broadcasting to our children, first of all? Is that the message we're sharing to the world and to ourselves? Is that who we're being? A society that sees not just itself but also others, a society that knows how to balance its own obligation and moral obligation of self-preservation with its own respect for others. We have a question which relates to what to say to North American Jews who blindly support Israel when that support sometimes comes at the expense of their view of Israel's interests or of Jewish values. There is a dynamic now, particularly in North America, something which actually we're discussing very much now in the Engaging Israel group, and will hopefully soon be publishing a whole set of articles about the nature of the discourse about Israel in the Jewish world. And you have this tendency of two different groups, one to say, one which says, unless you realize the great threat that Iran poses, unless you focus on those issues, on the crises facing Israel, unless the support for Israel is absolute, you are threatening Israel. You're giving ammunition to the enemies. And there are others who are so concerned about whether Israel is living up to its values, they want to open up the debate. There are different views that you can take about this, and I think we don't have time to get into this discussion at the moment. But again, I want to go back to, even in answering this question, this idea of who we want to be as a society, as a people engaged in conversation. What does it say about us if we exclude certain people from conversation or include them in a conversation? What is the nature of the Jewish discourse that we want to have about Israel? And I would challenge people, to think about whether the extent to which we are endangered either by a discourse that appears to be so worried about what will happen if we argue with each other and are seen to be arguing, that we in fact, instead of broadcasting strength, broadcast weakness, on the one hand, or a debate that is so open that doesn't have any kind of questions about the nature of that debate in a way that really does provide ammunition and weaken Israel's cause. And it's something, again, that we need to have a little bit more maturity in how we relate to this. I'll leave with one last question. We'll end with one last question we have about, well, I mentioned this term, a sovereign state of mind, and what is a sovereign state of mind? I'll say something that may get me in trouble, so I don't want it to be kind of mentioned too much, but it sometimes feels that in certain ways, despite the fact that we are in a sovereign state, Israel might conduct itself as a diaspora community, perhaps as the biggest diaspora community in the world. And particularly in the following respect, I think. When we are so preoccupied with the precariousness of our existence here in Israel, in the place that Yitzhak refused to leave, when we consider that existence here temporary, when we look at Israel as if it's an outcast and on the margins, not because others are treating us that way, but because that's the way we're viewing ourselves, these are classic symptoms of, I think, a diasporic way of thinking about Israel. You know, we use the word existential threat to talk about Israel about every 3 seconds, I think, in a conversation. Everything is an existential threat. Now, the crises are real, and we shouldn't diminish them. They are real, they need to be dealt with. But I think we have an obligation to broadcast confidence about our future here. We're not going anywhere. Not only should we be confident about the sovereign project of the Jewish state, but we have every reason to broadcast that confidence. Because ask yourself, who is empowered when you don't reflect that kind of sovereign state of mind that shakes off a little bit of this precariousness, of this obsession with crisis and resolution, rather than with just coping with uncertainty, better or worse, finding internal stability, being okay with that, with where you are. The people who are empowered most by that kind of mode of thinking, which is the opposite of a sovereign state of mind, are Israel's enemies. Because it feeds in them the idea that we are, like Hassan Nasrallah said, the cobwebs that can be removed quickly. And one of the things I think we need to ask ourselves as a people is, you know, we have come home to our state, to a sovereign state, but have we yet changed the diskette in our heads and come to terms with the idea that we need to be in a sovereign state of mind? We need to both grapple with the challenges and opportunities of power, but we can leave that messianic moment for a minute, the dichotomy of exile and redemption, of crisis and resolution, and we can be comfortable in the opportunities and the challenges that sovereignty provides with all of its uncertainty. I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. We'll be joining you. We hope you invite others as well to join us in about a month's time for another update and another discussion of the challenges facing Israel, but with some Jewish input, a Jewish perspective, and a new conversation based on the ideas developed at Engaging Israel. Thank you.